first people on earth to hear this part when they actually meet. So thanks for sticking it out.
Good things come to those who wait.
Things come to those who wait. Sunrise. En passant d'hier. The rooster crowed and Maggie woke. She made her way in the dark and stepped outside. Dawn crept through the valley. Maggie thought she heard a song, a faint smell of fish, and again she smelled smoke, sweet and familiar corn husks. She recognized sage burning. She was certain. She looked toward the sun as the rooster called it up. Instead, she saw the lumbering silhouette of Big Horse and his tall rider, trailed by a running wolf. Maggie fainted onto the hard, packed earth. Ears Up ran to her side, licked her drained skin. Big Horse Woman remained mounted, watching the woman's color slowly return. The paper white skin flushed with a wash of pink rising from the cheeks. This face was rough and weathered, the lines drawn as if a fine quill delicately traced every feature and strand of hair that grew like corn tassels by the river. It struck her as strangely wise, like an old woman's. The hair looked fine but slippery. Big Horse Woman imagined that braiding it would be like trying to braid wind or water. She chirped at Ears Up, stopped his licking. Revived by the cold nose and warm tongue, the woman was now stirring, then scrambled quickly to her feet, swaying there, looking up. She felt the back of her head, wincing. Maggie stared hard and long at Big Horse. She held her palms flat beneath his quivering nostrils and danced her fingers around his curious teeth. Big Horse nipped her sleeve and held it. Maggie pinched his nose to hold his head and whispered to him, "I knew you were strong. I knew you'd survive. But who is on your back that you carry to me? I wish how you could tell me everything." Maggie saw herself reflected in his black eyes. Big Horse let go her sleeve and nodded boldly. He nuzzled her long hay hair. "Woman, I well remember your voice." Big Horse Woman slid down Big Horse's shoulder, landing squarely before Maggie. She watched Maggie's lips as words rolled out. Many words spilled, and Big Horse Woman thought she must be surely naming everything in sight. Her people watched. They were keen onlookers, missing nothing obvious. And underneath the surface, they saw a lot. Even as they looked past you or stared at the ground on which you stood, you felt them look right through you, straight into your heart. This was how Big Horse Woman regarded Maggie now. And so it was a good thing Maggie had not been raised spoon-fed on fear, which most were. Maggie was full of love and common sense, and Big Horse Woman saw it just in the way she touched her horse. Big Horse Woman tried not to look into the blue eyes fixed upon her, but it was difficult. Maggie tried not to stare back directly, but it was hopeless. Her eyes locked on the face before her like a dream. She had never seen anyone with such beauty, color, and mystery, like a deep woods flower, its petals painted with forest pigments, her clay skin and coal black eyes. She wore a collar padded in cattail down, and her breath blew warm from her nostrils in the cool morning air. Feathers, bones, and charms hung from her dress and black hair. A bow quiver and countless other bags and pouches were strung across her back and waist. A thickly woven blue blanket wrapped her hips. Maggie lifted a hand ever so slowly and held it out in welcoming. There it remained until she proceeded to reach out and touch the woman's blue-painted wrist. Big Horse Woman stepped back, as did Big Horse. Maggie mirrored her, stepping back, courteous, remembering she was not to frighten her visitor. So she took a deep breath Waiting, Big Horsewoman greeted her, formally gesturing definitively with her hands, saying, Ijaje, wiwitate, shange, tanga, wa'u, shange, tanga, nita, anojin, eania, ebenia, kage. Maggie watched the woman cut the air with her fingers, nodded, and politely tried repeating what she heard. Eania, kageha. And so it was that a word or gesture led to the next until it became clear between them. Swimming colt, sh'ang shinga ni wang. Big Horsewoman watched Maggie as she rippled through a far pile of bark, sifting until she found what she'd searched for. Maggie laid flat, a tight curl of birch bark, a painting of a shining black colt swimming frantically through yellow water. Big Horsewoman recognized this picture. This she too had witnessed, this, and so she signed, I've seen this. She remembered back to the day she found Big Horse swallowed by the Nishu Day, its yellow floodwaters swirling round the black colt. Yes, she nodded, while removing a small pouch from under cover of her blanket. She reached into the pouch and raised her hand to reveal the charm inside. The shriveled trimming of the colt's soft hoof curled in on itself. Like a pretzel, Maggie thought. The trimmed hoof had been Big Horse's when he was that colt, pulled from that river. Big Horsewoman had saved the first hoof trimming, tied it to a crow feather. She had never shown this charm to another but grandmother, who had helped her in making it then when she needed it. Now that Maggie saw it, she understood that Big Horsewoman had the colt from the beginning, when it was just lost from Maggie, when its feet were still so small. It was Big Horse that bound them together. His hubei that they had already shared. Big Horsewoman watched the blue skirt, keeper of so many big horses. She watched her flinch when she saw the little charm of feathered colt's foot. Maggie stared and flew back to that day, thrashing hooves, roaring water, the colt's head bobbing, pulling away, eyes rolling white, the raging river, dark, yellow water, deep, black depths, her bursting lungs, the willow roots that saved her, and how she clung. Maggie raised her eyes, and they were glistening fresh with tears, though long years had passed since. Big Horse was the current that brought them together, the current that now streamed between them. And they learned to speak to each other through the language of plants. A basic language formed between them in the naming of the plants. As they learned each other's familiar names for plants, they shared vocabulary, and it continued to grow rapidly. They recognized common roots. In Panka, all roots were thunga, and all flowers were wakta, while fruit were waktahe, whatever the kind. Maka was herb, mankam was medicine, and so on. Maggie called most plants foods. Some were medicines, and others herbs. Some were soups, and others warts. Wart was the old world word for herb, the whole plant. Motherwort, St. John's wort, woundwort, spiderwort. Berry was what she called small fruits. Juneberry, serviceberry, strawberry, raspberry, buffalo berry, blueberry. Big Horsewoman gathered that Maggie was calling many plants by their flowers. Maggie realized the Ponca word for flower also meant blossom or fruit. They shared their words for plants whose flowers were in bloom. Thus their speech swiftly expanded. With the naming of plants came each other's words. Corn Circle, Wahaba Wangide. Big Horsewoman spent a moon with Magghie. It shone down on the valley and pulled them close together. In that time, all the trees came to leaf and many plants came to flower. With this changing moon, she did not feel the pull to leave. Today, they rested in the shade of an old willow tree. Big Horsewoman filled a gourd with cool running water and sprinkled a generous handful of cornmeal powder into it. This she stirred with a willow wand until the drink was mixed, the corn powder frothy. She offered the gourd to the flushed cheeks of her friend, who gladly took the gritty refreshment. As Magghie drank the cool drink, she looked at the cornmeal pouch with curiosity and lifted her hand to it. Then Magghie looked away embarrassed again at her curiosity. When she looked back, Big Horsewoman was brushing clean a nearby slab of river rock. She sprinkled a circle of corn powder on the flat rock, and the speckled cornmeal glistened. On the wheel, she carefully placed 5 grains, each a different color, each in a different direction, singing to the corn to the east where she placed a red kernel. Red ear of maize, the little ones shall make of this their bodies. To the south, a blue. Blue ear and blue squash, these plants also shall be food for the little ones. To the west, she placed a white kernel. White ear and white squash, and they shall always live to see old age. To the north, a speckled yellow. Speckled ear and speckled squash. In the center, a pinch of the corn powder. Then wedded together the maize and squash, these plants shall be food for the little ones, and they shall always live to see old age, and they shall be difficult for death to overcome them. As she finished the song, she handed a silvery, soft moleskin pouch to Magghie, who emptied it into her rough palm. Her fingers sifted through the precious kernels, the rainbow in her hand. And then Big Horsewoman disappears after another nightmare. And this is from Maggie's point of view. Big Horsewoman was gone. Magghie searched for her, followed the deep footfalls Big Horse made across the plains, lost his trail in the slippery canyons of faraway hills. Days passed as she circled the hills, valleys, cliffs, and creeks, nearly lost herself. Frost came and licked the rock with ice. Maggie's mare lost footing. They had to walk back limping, care for their old aches and new wounds. Many wars followed in the days after. The tales passed round about these women vary greatly as to how the story ends. Some say they both went into hiding with remnants of the tribe. Some say they carried on in the hidden valley and were not part of what died. Some say Magghie and Big Horsewoman shared powers to elude discovery, that Big Horsewoman harnessed the winds and Magghie tamed the sun. Together, they sent messages from the earth to the sky, to other places, people, lodges, clouds and puffs of smoke, winds and whispers, tickling breezes. They conjured fogs and gathered mists over the valley when strangers came near. They disappeared like ghosts, diverted paths, confused compasses, distracted trackers, trappers, scouts, and guides, and no one found them. They were keepers of sacred ground that they kept invisible. Big Horse Valley near Planting Creek was never again discovered except by storytellers. The women were spirits long before their deaths. Some say they still live. Some say a good story is a circle and ends where it begins. And this is how it ends from Big Horsewoman's point of view. Forced into thin air by walls of fire, trapping them nowhere to turn, Big Horse leapt with Big Horsewoman, plummeted off the cliff. In the fall, her smell went dead. The choking smoke no longer mattered. She couldn't breathe anyway. She felt the flames lick her skin. She felt the singe of horse hair under her fingers, frying to dust. She felt embers falling on her hips, saw the hot yellow air all around her, felt her eyelashes curl, closed her eyes reflexive, knowing she did not need her eyes for the landing, that she would rather rise above it. Her senses shut down one by one, her nose, eyes, ears, tongue, touch, until all she knew was a voice inside and the all-seeing eye in her heart. And so she pulled the sole of her horse up with all the strength she had in the rope between them. She threw her head back, Lily, to the sky, clicked. Her tongue flew up at a gallop. Bighorn legs stretched out, let go her arms, let them take her up, wings away from hard ground, back to the sky where they came from. They hovered there, still at the edge of the cliff, watching below. She saw the fire swallow them. She saw the earth cracked open. She saw torches of black oil and smoke and vapors and ruptured veins deep inside her, fractured mountains, broken backs, high peaks, bones showing, trees hacked. She watched lines of knives, scythe, swift across the plains, and running metal boxes slice across iron tracks, dust storms and bowls and funnels widening wide, and big mirror houses shining like porcupine needles straight up to the sky. She saw the black snake oozing through the grasslands, saw the browning of green places, the greening of snow-covered hills, saw the endless melting pools that resulted in the flooding and the screaming the world over, with every kind of voice shouting, begging to be heard. Floods and fires and storms joined at the corners and bred into a steaming cloud that engulfed the earth and warmed it, and the voices rising muffled the earth, suffocating. She heard her grumbling groan deep inside as she pitched and rolled and slowed her pulse, reaching deep inside her core, waking up in a sudden silence like the eye before a storm. Big Horsewoman knew what had to be done. She fell back, flew down, kicked Big Horse fast and hard, and started up a cold wind and dragged in all the stars that dusted the sky with all her relations and all those who had ever been before her. She whipped them up with the lash of her quirt. Her lily sang up the oceans, wrangled in the rivers, called up the mountains, and aimed her arrow to draw herself back to earth. Now was the time to turn back once again. She led the charge from the sky, and all the shooting stars followed. Weep the hum.